So maybe we store those three separately, but maybe not the variations in tempo, the variations in formality, the variations in degree of intoxication. Maybe we don't store those separately. Or maybe we do. That's another issue on which phonologists have with which phonologists have wrestled. So that's what I intend to mean by top 1, top 2, and top 3, and so on. Okay, another dimension, orthogonal to the previous one. How do we spell these representations? What is it that's in our head? When you learn phonetics, you learn articulatory phonetics. So you learn to classify sounds by what your mouth is doing when you make that sound. So you learn about the lips and the tongue, closure and vocal cord vibration and all that stuff. So are we storing articulatory information? Or speech sounds have acoustic characteristics. They have frequencies, they have component harmonic frequencies, they have fundamental frequency, they have silence and noise and various other characteristics. Maybe we store those. Or maybe we store them separately, store both. There are models out there which argue that we have a production grammar and a perception grammar. In fact, there are models of optimality theory that have both going simultaneously, and they fight with each other, and that's how you end up with language change. There is a whole school of psychology that is represented in linguistics by Carol Fowler, and in psychology by the work of Arthur Gibson and his colleagues, that argues that representations are actually not stored in any particular modal way, that we have some kind of neutral representation independent of what our mouths are doing or what our ears are hearing, but somehow unites them. And some others have argued that there's simply a uniting of articulatory but acoustic representations. And then lastly, assuming we think that when we talk about the T sound, that we've made a categorization of all the kinds of T's there could be, the T of top and the T of stop and the T of catnip, what kind of category is that? Because, of course, philosophers have wrestled with the idea of categorization for a very long time. And until the 1970s and 80s, everybody assumed that a category was what Aristotle said a category was, which was essentially the old Venn diagram. You draw a circle around the sounds, and a sound is either in that diagram, in that circle, or out of that circle. So for those of you who had a little bit of history of linguistics, you may remember Bernard Bloch's dictum, once a phoneme, always a phoneme, so that a particular sound, such as that R sound in riding and writing, that is, writing, that sound seems to be a member of both the T and the D phoneme. That can't be. So Bernard Bloch had to develop a complex model to account for the fact that that R sound couldn't be a member of both a T and a D phoneme, and therefore he had to have a rule changing T's to D's, and then the D would be pronounced as one flap sound. Another possibility is that categorization is irrelevant to phonology, and some generativists have either said that or simply not talked about making categories, or not talked about whether sounds are categories or not. Daniel Jones, who was one of the founders of the International Phonetic Association and wrote this very interesting book called The Phoneme in the 1950s, he used, I'm having a slight anomia. There we go. He used the Wittgensteinian sense of family resemblance to say that the members of a phoneme share a family resemblance with one another. So that you couldn't necessarily come up with a single common characteristic that is a genus and differentia in the Aristotelian sense. And that's why phonemes behaved a little bit differently than some other more traditional Aristotelian categories. Recently, psychologists, as I said, have wrestled with exemplar theory as an idea for what a category is. It's essentially a number of repeated similar instances of something that you gradually assemble into a slightly generalized representation of something, but you allow for fuzziness around the edges. And then I think many of you have already heard me on previous occasions talk about phonemes as prototypes. prototype category where you can't necessarily find a single common unifying characteristic of a phoneme, of a sound, to say it's in a category, but you can motivate each of the different members of the phoneme by plausible extensions from one sound to another. Okay, so I've set out the issues here. Now, supposing we actually wanted to decide what was right, that is, supposedly we wanted to be scientists, issue we were discussing a little bit earlier in the context of anthropology. So what might constitute evidence for a decision one way or the other? Well, there's a lot of experimental evidence on issues related to this. I'm going to just mention a few of them that I think are really cool or interesting. Turns out that if you ask people to do your standard psycholinguistic experiment methodology and you say, listen to these words and push the button when you hear a P sound, turns out people have faster reactions if the voice they're hearing is someone they're familiar with. Does that mean we store individual people saying individual words? We access that somehow faster because it's more familiar and therefore more available? That's some of the evidence for exemplar theory, which argues that that's exactly how we work. There's also some evidence that the more we say, more frequently we say certain things, that has an influence on how we are storing it. I'm not going to say a whole lot about that. I will say, however, a little bit more about the next thing, which is there is this concept, to step totally outside phonology for a moment, in music, which is traditionally called either absolute pitch or perfect pitch, which some of you might be familiar with, which is the ability of some people, but not all people, when you play a note, for them to be able to say, oh, that's a B flat. Or, conversely, you can ask them, would you please sing for me a B flat? And they can do it. And it used to be believed that this was an ability that only some people had. Until a really interesting guy who started out as a rock musician producer named Daniel Levitin got really interested in this question and eventually got a PhD in psychology, perceptual psychology, looking at absolute pitch. Because his theory was it's actually not a specialized skill. Everybody has it in a specific way. What he did was the following. Now, this works best with people growing up in a literate, technologically advanced culture, such as North America or Europe. He asked your standard undergraduate victims, psychology experiment victims, to think of he chose specific songs. Beatles, Let It Be, people my age, Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Waters. Maybe some of you who are younger than me can think of a more current example. But these are songs that are played on the radio all the time. Everybody knows them. He said, fine, sing it for me. No warning, no background, nothing, no supporting information, just sing it. Then he analyzed the fundamental frequency where they began, the pitch of the song, where they began it. And it turns out with overwhelmingly beyond chance frequency, they always started on the same note as the iconic original recording. Which means they had in their heads absolute pitch. They knew the correct pitch that Simon and Garfunkel began on, that the Beatles began on, that, that it was in there. Now, that doesn't mean they can name it. And what Levitin argues is absolute pitch is not the ability to store an absolute pitch, it's the ability to name it. And that you need A, training for, and B, some kind of special skill that not everybody has. But the actual sound, you've got in there, which is an amazing thought. And it tells us that we know way more